Beneath the Iraqi desert, clay tablets sleep in silence, each one carrying secrets pressed into mud 5,000 years ago. But here is what keeps archaeologists awake at night. This first civilization appeared fully formed, with no slow evolution, no trial and error. They already knew the stars, already mastered mathematics, and already understood forces we are only now rediscovering. What if everything we call beginning was actually the last echo of something far older? What if the Sumerians were not inventing civilization, but remembering it? The air above southern Iraq shimmers with ancient heat. Sand the color of old bones stretches toward a horizon that has watched empires rise and crumble. Yet beneath this desolation, fragments of clay still hold their breath, waiting. They speak of cosmic order, divine mathematics, and a flood that erased the world. The dust is finally beginning to speak. Beneath the southern Iraqi desert, a silence has reigned for 5,000 years. The air above the plains of Mesopotamia shimmers with a heat that feels as old as time itself. Sand the color of bleached bones stretches toward a horizon that has witnessed the birth and death of every empire humanity has ever known. Yet beneath this desolation, buried under layers of ancient silt and sun-baked dust, fragments of clay are waiting for someone to hear them. These are the records of Sumer, a civilization that should not exist according to every rule of evolutionary progress. A culture that seems to have arrived on the stage of history fully formed, holding the refined blueprints for everything we call modern life. This is a library of clay, and what it contains might change every assumption we have about our origin. When British and French archaeologists first drove their spades into the Mesopotamian plains in the late 1800s, they were looking for the biblical roots of the ancient world. They expected to find the crude beginnings of human society, perhaps some mud huts and basic stone tools. Instead, they unearthed something that defied every assumption about how civilizations emerge. They found cities like Uruk and Ur, places where tens of thousands of people lived in organized urban centers with plumbing, high walls, and massive temples. But it was a writing that truly shook the foundations of history. They discovered tens of thousands of clay tablets, each one carrying secrets pressed into mud 5 millennia ago. These were not the hesitant scratches of a newborn culture learning to express itself. They were sophisticated, systematic, and strangely complete. The Sumerians appeared in history around 3500 BC with their language fully formed, their cities geometrically precise, and their understanding of the stars already refined to a degree that would not be matched for thousands of years. There was no slow evolution, no trial and error, no evidence of a culture learning how to build or how to count. They already knew the stars. They already mastered mathematics. They already understood forces we are only now rediscovering. History favors slow progress, one tool leading to the next, a gradual climb from the cave to the city. But the Sumerians shattered that comfortable narrative. It was as if civilization had been downloaded from an earlier source, and their own record suggests exactly that. The air in the archives of Nippur and Nineveh must have been heavy with the scent of baked earth. These were the first libraries, places where knowledge was stored not just for utility, but for eternity. The Sumerians used a writing system called cuneiform. It was not merely an alphabet. It was a geometry of meaning. Triangular impressions arranged to hold both sound and symbol, recording everything from medical treatments to star movements with meticulous care. They documented the phases of Venus with a precision we only confirmed with modern telescopes. They tracked Jupiter and Mars across the night sky. They divided time and space using a base 60 mathematical system that still governs our clocks and our compasses today. Every hour we count and every minute that passes still echoes their design. But here is what keeps archaeologists awake at night. the oldest written words in human history, do not describe primitive survival or simple needs. They speak of cosmic order, divine mathematics, and a flood that erased an entire world. They speak of teachers who descended from the sky, and kings who ruled for impossible spans of time. They speak as though they were remembering something that came before them, something we have forgotten entirely. What if everything we call the beginning was actually the last echo of something far older? What if the Sumerians were not inventing civilization, but restoring it? Among the thousands of tablets recovered from the desert, one document stands apart in its strangeness. It is called the Sumerian King List. It reads like a historical record, listing rulers, cities, and dates with bureaucratic precision. But then the numbers become impossible. The list begins with a line that has haunted scholars for a century. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. This opening line launches into a chronicle where 8 kings rule for a total of 241,200 years. One king is recorded as reigning for 36,000 years, another for 43,200. Scholars have struggled with this document for over a century. Were these numbers symbolic? Were they astronomical cycles disguised as political history? Or were the Sumerians preserving a literal memory of a time when the boundary between heaven and earth was not yet fixed? What makes the king list so unsettling is its context. These were not mythological poems or religious hymns. They were administrative records written in the same precise hand that tallied grain harvests and temple offerings. To the Sumerians, this list was history, not fantasy. The cities mentioned in these ancient sections, Eridu, Uruk, and Kish, are real. Archaeologists have excavated their ruins, finding layer upon layer construction stretching back almost 8,000 years. Beneath the oldest known structures lie even older foundations, sealed by ancient silt deposits that suggest massive flooding occurred around 2900 BC. The pattern encoded in these impossible rains appears elsewhere too. The numbers frequently appear as multiples of 3,600. The Sumerian unit, called the Sar, used to measure astronomical cycles. Was this king list actually a celestial calendar? Were these rulers not individuals, but epochs? Their reigns marking the slow precession of the stars across the heavens. Then the list records a turning point. Then the flood swept over. No explanation is given. No moral judgment is passed. It is simply an event that resets everything. After the waters recede, kingship descend from heaven once more, and the measurements of time become human again. Nearly every ancient culture shares the same rhythm. Divine rulers, a catastrophic flood, and a new beginning. The Egyptian Turin Papyrus lists gods and demigods ruling before the human pharaohs. Hindu texts describe vast ages lasting tens of thousands of years. Mayan texts speak of earlier worlds destroyed by water. It is as if humanity remembers a melody but has forgotten the words. Perhaps the king list preserves something beyond individual reigns. Perhaps it is a compressed memory of vast spans of time, of ages when the world operated under different rules. The Sumerians did not just glance at the night sky and wonder. They measured it, recorded it, and aligned their entire civilization according to its rhythms with a precision that seems impossible for people who had just emerged from the Stone Age. Their temples were not randomly placed. Every major ziggurat was oriented to celestial points, the rising of specific stars, solstice alignments, and the places where Venus appeared at dawn. The great ziggurat of Ur, built nearly 6,000 years ago, faces the cardinal directions with almost perfect accuracy. This feat of architectural awareness implies both mathematical sophistication and centuries of systematic observation. Among the thousands of tablets recovered, A subset stands out known as the star charts. These texts list constellations, equinoxes, and the precise rising and setting times of planets. They calculate the synodic cycle of Venus with an error margin of less than a single day. We needed telescopes to achieve that level of accuracy. The Sumerians also understood the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that takes roughly 72 years to shift just 1 degree, measuring that requires continuous observation spanning centuries. Yet their inscriptions already reflect awareness of this cosmic drift, as though they had inherited records from observers who came long before the first spade ever hit the sand. Their cosmology was mathematical. Each major god corresponded to a planet. For the Sumerians, the universe was not a collection of random objects. It was a living system whose movements were sacred and whose numbers were divine. They did not separate astronomy from religion or mathematics from myth. Everything was one interconnected pattern. In one tablet, a scribe carefully drew the path of Jupiter across the night sky using a mathematical system that modern astronomers recognize as a rudimentary form of calculus. These were not religious metaphors. They were geometric observations dressed in poetic language. But where did this knowledge begin? Did a culture just emerging from reed huts and mud bricks truly develop such refined astronomy on their own? Or were they, as their own records suggest, restoring what had been lost beneath the temples and palaces of ancient Sumer? There are traces of knowledge that should not exist at the dawn of civilization, evidence of technologies appearing before their supposed invention, formulas that read like early chemistry, tools and techniques that suggest an inheritance rather than an innovation. The Sumerians possess a word for knowledge, the me, that did not mean learning as we understand it. It meant something closer to fundamental codes or cosmic formulas. To them, science was not invention. It was memory. When excavations uncovered tablets detailing ziggurat construction, researchers expected rough sketches. Instead, they found precise measurements, proportional ratios, and geometric calculations. The architects understood volumes, slopes, and weight distribution. They were working from a blueprint passed down from a vanished source. Their medicine was equally advanced. One tablet catalogs over 200 medicinal plants organized by therapeutic function. Another describes mixing sulfur, copper, and oil to create compounds used in purification rituals. There are even references to the shining liquid, which some scholars believe refers to distilled mercury, though such a material should not have been known in that era. Metallurgy poses similar puzzles. By 3000 BC, the Sumerians were smelting copper and experimenting with bronze alloys. Yet traces of hardened bronze appear in layers that predate this timeline. Their cylinder seals depict saws, drills, and bellows, tools suggesting a level of craftsmanship unexplained by the artifacts we have actually recovered. Everything arrived at once. The writing, the math, the law, and the stars. Some scholars have noted that Sumerian technical vocabulary contains loan words from an unknown, non-Semitic language. These are the traces of an extinct scientific lexicon. We do not know who spoke it, only that its remnants survive like linguistic fossils embedded in Sumerian speech. Perhaps these words belong to whoever the Sumerians themselves remembered. The civilization before the flood. If clay could speak, the archives would tell us that these were deliberate acts of preservation. They were desperate attempts to ensure that what was known would not be forgotten. The scribes were guardians of continuity. They spent years memorizing hundreds of signs, learning to read, and write in a system so complex that mastering it was an act of devotion. The clay tablet was their sacred bridge to the past. Fire and burial preserved them where papyrus would have crumbled. They wrote anyway, trusting clay more than stone. And they were right. Long after their cities collapsed, their words endure. Their numerals define our clocks. Their geometry shapes our buildings. Their myths live in our religions. Each tablet was a time capsule, a plea against erasure. They knew knowledge could vanish. They had seen it happen before. And every wedge in clay was an act of defiance against the silence of the desert. The Sumerians did not view their history as a slow crawl from the mud. They saw it as a gift, a kingship lowered from the heavens. This belief is not hidden in some obscure poem or forgotten prayer. It is carved into the very foundation of their administrative records. Among the thousands of clay fragments pulled from the shimmering dust of southern rock, one document stands apart in its strangeness. It is known as the Sumerian King List, and it is arguably the most unsettling piece of evidence ever recovered from the ancient world. Imagine a four-sided clay prism, the color of sun-baked bone. It is covered in the tight, sharp wedges of cuneiform script. To a modern eye, it looks like a ledger, perhaps a tally of grain harvests or a list of temple goats. But when the first scholars began to translate these lines in the early 20th century, they found themselves staring into a timeline that defied every rule of biology and physics. The list begins at the absolute beginning, before the world we recognize had even taken shape. It does not speak of tribal chiefs or nomadic wanderers. It begins with a declaration of divine intent. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. In Eridu, a king named Alulim took the throne. According to the record, he ruled for 28,800 years. Pause for a moment and let that number settle. 28,000 years. That is longer than the entirety of recorded human history, as we teach it in our schools today. Yet, the Sumerian scribe does not blink. He does not use flowery language or poetic metaphors to explain this span. He simply records a number as a matter of bureaucratic fact. Alulim is followed by a Laogar, who ruled for 36,000 years. Then kingship moves to other cities. Bad Tibra, Larsa, Shuruppak. By the time the 8th king completes his reign and the list reaches its first major turning point, nearly 250,000 years have passed. What keeps archaeologists awake at night is not the mere existence of these numbers, but the context in which they were written. These were not mythological poems intended for religious festivals. They were chronological records written in the same hand that recorded taxes, laws, and commercial debts. To the Sumerians, this list was history. It was a formal account of their origins. The question that haunts us is why a civilization so obsessed with precision, so meticulous in its mathematics, will record such impossible reigns as truth. The numbers themselves hide a deeper code. If you look closely at the math, you see that the reigns are not random. They are all multiples of 3,600. This was the Sumerian unit known as the Sar. This was the foundation of their sexagesimal system, a base 60 mathematical structure that still governs our world today. It is the reason our clocks have 60 minutes and our circles have 360 degrees. The Sumerians used this system to track the movements of the planets and the slow, grinding cycles of the stars. Some researchers wonder if the king list is actually a celestial calendar disguised as a political record. Were these kings actual flesh and blood rulers who lived for eons, or were they symbols for the stars themselves? Were their reigns intended to track the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of the earth that takes thousands of years to complete a single cycle? If the Sumerians were tracking the heavens with such precision, it implies they have been watching the sky for a time far longer than we are willing to admit. It suggests their history did not begin in 3500 BC, but was a continuation of something far older. Then comes the line that resets the world. It is short, brutal, and final. Then the flood swept over. Just like that, the ledger of the gods is closed. There is no moral explanation given in the king list, no divine anger or human sin. There is only an event that divides a timeline into two distinct halves. The antediluvian world, where kings live for tens of thousands of years, and the post-flood world, where the rains begin to shrink. After the waters recede, the list says kingship was again lowered from heaven. But now, the numbers have changed. The kings of Kish and Uruk rule for hundreds of years instead of thousands. These numbers still feel impossible to us, but they are trending toward the human. Eventually, the list reaches figures we know to be real, like the famous Gilgamesh, whose reign is listed as 126 years. As the list moves closer to the scribe's own time, the numbers become entirely ordinary. Decades, years, months. This transition from the impossible to the historical is what makes the document so credible to the Sumerian mind. It is a bridge between a lost age of giants and the gritty reality of mortal men. And here is where the desert begins to reveal its secrets. For decades, historians dismissed the early parts of the king list as pure fantasy. But then, archaeologists began to find the cities. They found Eridu. They found Shuruppak. Beneath the ruins of these ancient centers, they discovered something that sent a chill through the scientific community. In the late 1920s, excavators at the site of UR found a layer of sterile silt, nearly 10 feet thick, sandwiched between layers of human habitation. It was clean river mud, empty of artifacts, empty of life. It was evidence of a massive inundation that had occurred around 2900 BC. Similar deposits were found at Kish and Shuruppak. It was as if the ground itself was confirming the Sumerian memory. A flood had indeed swept over the land. It had buried the old world in mud and forced the survivors to start again. But if the flood was real and the cities were real, what are we to make of the kings who ruled before the water? Were they an entirely different kind of human? Or were they something else entirely? The Sumerians called their teachers Anunnaki. They claimed that these beings had descended from the sky to provide the foundations of civilization. They taught the humans how to measure, how to farm, and how to write. In the Sumerian mind, there was no such thing as a slow evolution of ideas. Knowledge was a download. It was a gift given by those who possessed a different understanding of time. Every major culture on Earth shares an echo of this same sequence. The Egyptian Turin Papyrus lists divine rulers who governed for thousands of years before the first human pharaoh. The Hindu Puranas speak of vast ages of time called yugas, where human life spanned thousands of years before falling into decay. Even the Bible, in the book of Genesis, lists patriarchs before the flood who lived for nearly a millennium. Methuselah, Noah, Adam, they are all echoes of the same Sumerian rhythm. Perhaps we are a species with amnesia. We look at the ruins in the desert and see the crude beginnings of a primitive people. But the Sumerians look back at us through their clay tablets and tell a different story. They tell us that they were the survivors of a golden age. They tell us that they were the heirs to a science that saw the universe as a mathematical harmony. They weren't inventing civilization. They were trying to reconstruct it from fragments of a world that had drowned. The king list serves as a map of that reconstruction. It is a desperate attempt to maintain a link to a time when kingship was not just a political office, but a divine mandate. The scribe who pressed those wedges into wet clay 4,000 years ago was not writing for his contemporaries. He was writing for continuity. He was ensuring that the names of the first rulers would not be erased by the blowing sands. As the heat shimmers over the Mesopotamian plains today, the silence of the ruins is heavy with the weight of these numbers. We are left to wonder if our modern understanding of human history is merely a tiny fragment of a much larger cycle. We measure our progress in centuries, but the Sumerians measured theirs in thousands of years. They looked at the stars and saw a clock that moved so slowly we have forgotten how to read its face. What if the king list is not a record of how long men lived, but a record of how much we have lost? What if the shrinking reigns of the kings were a reflection of a world that was slowly losing its connection to the source of its knowledge? The Sumerians lived in the shadow of that loss. Every ziggurat they built, every star they mapped, was an effort to reach back toward that moment when kingship first descended from heaven. They left us their ledgers. They left us their math. And they left us a timeline that suggests humanity is far older and perhaps far more mysterious than we have ever dared to imagine. As we dig deeper into the silt of the Iraqi desert, we are not just finding old buildings. We are finding the fingerprints of a civilization that claimed to know the secrets of the deep. And as the translation of these tablets continues, we find ourselves asking the same question the Sumerians might have asked. If the kings of old could rule for tens of thousands of years, what happened to change the very nature of our existence? The answer may lie not in the earth, but in the stars that the Sumerians watched with such terrifying precision. The air above the Mesopotamian plains does not just hold heat. It holds a heavy, expectant silence. Beneath the shifting dunes of southern Iraq, the ruins of Eridu and the poor wait for the sun to set, their shadows stretching like long, dark fingers across the dust of 5 millennia. We were told that the story of humanity began in a garden. We were told of a simple creation, a single breath, and a sudden awakening. But the Sumerians remembered something different. They press into their wet clay a narrative that feels less like a religious hymn and more like a technical manual. They spoke of a void that was not empty, but filled with the intent of beings who saw the earth not as a sanctuary, but as a project. This is where the comfortable myth of our origins begins to crack. This is the moment we realize that the oldest records on earth do not describe the childhood of our species, but sophisticated, calculated redesign. When archaeologists first translated the Atrahasis epic, they expected to find a primitive attempt to explain the world. Instead, they found a gritty, cosmic drama that upends every theological assumption we have ever made. The text describes a time before humans existed, when the gods themselves labored to shape the earth. They dug the rivers, they cleared the canals, and they grew weary of the endless work. In the Sumerian mind, creation was not an act of love. It was a solution to a labor crisis. The great gods, the Anunnaki, decided to fashion a servant who could bear the burdens of the world. They chose Enki, the god of wisdom and the deep waters, to oversee the task. But he did not just breathe life into dust. The Sumerians recorded that he mixed the clay of the earth with the blood of a sacrifice god. They used the term Lulu-Amu to describe the result. It literally translates to the mixed worker. Think about that for a moment. This is not a story of a divine spark given to a clay statue. This is a description of a genetic mingling, a fusion of terrestrial matter and celestial essence. The Sumerians were describing a hybrid being, a bridge between two worlds. They wrote that the first humans were not born. They were manufactured. They were made to work the fields, to feed the gods, and to maintain the cosmic order. This perspective changes everything we know about our purpose. It suggests that humanity was not an end in itself, but a means to an end. And yet, there is a mystery hidden within the blood. By mixing divine essence into the clay, the gods accidentally gave their creations a capacity for something they did not anticipate. They gave them memory. They gave them the ability to look at the stars and recognize them as home. The Sumerians spoke of the me, the divine blueprints that governed every aspect of existence. These were not abstract laws. They were physical objects, tablets, or perhaps tools that contained the fundamental codes of civilization. There was a me for kingship, a me for weaving, a me for music, and even a me for the making of weapons. These were the formulas of reality, the operating system of the world. To possess the me was to possess the power of creation itself. One of their most haunting myths tells of the goddess Inanna stealing these tablets from Enki while he was in a drunken stupor. She carried them back to her city of Uruk, and as she did, civilization awakened. It was as if she had downloaded the cultural DNA of a lost era and brought it to a new people. This idea of downloaded knowledge is what keeps modern researchers awake at night. Why did the Sumerians appear in history with their mathematics already perfected? Why were their legal systems, their schools, and their surgical techniques fully formed from the very first moment we find them? If you look at the progress of any other culture, you see the slow, halting steps of invention. You see the rough stone tool before the polished bronze. But in Sumer, everything arrives at once. It is as though they were not learning, but remembering. They were like survivors of a shipwreck, rebuilding their world from a set of instructions they managed to save from the waves. In the ruins of Eridu, archaeologists have found evidence that supports this feeling of ancient continuity. Beneath the oldest temples are even older foundations, stretching back into a prehistory we cannot yet name. The Sumerians called Eridu the first city, the place where kingship first descended from heaven. They believed the god Enki lived there in a temple called the Abzu, which sat atop the deep subterranean waters of wisdom. When we excavate these sites, we find artifacts that defy the timeline of a primitive society. We find diorite stones drilled with precision that would require diamond-tipped tools today. We find evidence of metallurgy that suggests an advanced understanding of temperature and alloys long before the official start of the Bronze Age. What if the Sumerian creation myth is not a fantasy, but a suppressed memory of a technological origin? They describe the gods experimenting with the human form. The tablets tell of Ninmah, the Lady of Life, making several attempts to create a functional human. She made a being who could not hold its bladder, one who was blind, and one who was barren. Each time, Enki found a place for them in society, giving them a role and a purpose. It reads like a lab report of a biological trial, a series of prototypes leading toward a final model. This is not how a culture invents a god. This is how a culture remembers a complicated, messy beginning. And then there is the silence of the gods. The Sumerians recorded that after the flood, the Anunnaki began to withdraw. The direct communication that had once existed between heaven and earth was severed. The god became distant, speaking only through omens and the movement of the stars. Humanity was left with the fragments of the me, the codes they had been given to survive. They spent the next 3,000 years trying to preserve those fragments, building ziggurats that reached toward the sky in a desperate attempt to call back their teachers. They were like children left in a vast library, unable to read most of the books, but knowing that the secrets to their existence were hidden on the shelves. When we look at the Enuma Elish, the epic of creation, we see the battle between order and chaos. Tiamat, the primordial mother of the deep waters, is defeated by Marduk, who uses her body to fashion the heavens and the earth. This is often read as a simple myth of good versus evil. But to the Sumerians, it was a story of the stabilization of the solar system. They described planets as living beings, their orbits as paths of destiny. They spoke of a cosmic collision that reshaped the world. Modern astronomers have found that the composition of the inner planets and the asteroid belt matches the descriptions of this ancient battle with startling accuracy. How could a people who only recently learned to know the history of the planets? They knew it because they said their teachers were the ones who saw it happen. Every wedge-shaped mark in the clay was an act of defiance against forgetting. The Sumerians were obsessed with lists. They listed their kings, their gods, their constellations, and their laws with bureaucratic precision. They were terrified of the void. They knew that a world had ended before theirs, and they suspected that theirs would one day end too. They wrote their records on clay because they knew that fire and water could not destroy it. They were building a fortress of information. They were trying to ensure that when the next catastrophe came, the memory of humanity would not be erased. We are only now beginning to hear the echoes of that voice. For thousands of years, these tablets were buried under the dust of forgotten empires. The Greeks did not know them. The Romans did not read them. Our entire history was built on the much younger records of the Mediterranean and the Levant. But now, as we pull these shards of mud from the earth, we are confronted with a version of ourselves that we have completely forgotten. We are seeing a humanity that was born in the shadows of giants. A humanity that was given the tools of the stars before it knew how to plow a field. What if we are not the pinnacle of an upward climb, but the guardians of a diminishing legacy? The Sumerians believed that the further they moved from the time of the gods, the more knowledge was lost. They saw history not as progress, but as decay. They looked back at their ancestors with envy, believing they lived longer, saw more clearly, and walked with beings who knew the secrets of the universe. In our modern age, we pride ourselves on our invention, but the Sumerians would look at our computers and our rockets and see only the crude recovery of things they once possessed. They would see us as children finally learning to read the first few pages of the Me. The air above southern Iraq remains still. The ruins of Uruk and Lagash are silent, but the tablets they hold are screaming. They are telling us that we have misread our own origin. They are telling us that we are part of a larger, older, and more terrifying story than we ever dared to imagine. As we decode the next fragment, as we translate the next line of cuneiform, we are not just discovering the past. We are rewriting our future. We are realizing that the void is not empty. It is filled with the echoes of those who came before us, those who mixed their blood with our clay, and those who are still waiting for us to remember who we are. Perhaps the Sumerians were right. Perhaps kingship did descend from heaven. And perhaps the reason we still look at the night sky with such longing is because our very essence was forged in the cold light of the stars. The clay in our bones remembers the hands that shaped it. The blood in our veins remembers the gods who gave it. And as the desert wind blows over the mounds of Mesopotamia, it carries the faint, persistent whisper of a truth we are only now starting to hear. We were never meant to be alone in the void. We were meant to be the memory of the gods. The story of the Sumerians is not a closed chapter. It is a mirror. In their records, we see the reflection of a world that understood its place in the cosmic order. They did not see themselves as masters of nature, but as participants in a vast mathematical symphony. They knew that every movement of a planet, every flood of the river, and every word written in clay was part of a single, interconnected pattern. They lived in a world where the sacred and the scientific were the same thing. And as we stand in the ruins of their cities, holding their tablets in our hands, we have to ask ourselves, did we lose our way when we decided that the stars were just cold rocks and the clay was just mud? The transition from the ancient world to our own was not a leap forward. It was a shattering. We took the unity of Sumerian knowledge and broke it into pieces. We turned their astronomy into superstition and their science into myth. We forgot the formulas of the Me and replaced them with the shadows of our own imagination. But the clay does not forget. It waits. It holds the original code, the first instructions, the echoes of the void. And as the sun dips below the horizon in Iraq, turning the sand the color of old bone, the records of first civilization continue to shimmer with a truth that can change everything we know about humanity. We are not the authors of our story. We are the inheritors of a message that was written before time began. The answer to where we are going may be hidden in the very first place we started, in the mud of the riverbanks, in the blood of the creators, and in the impossible numbers of the kings who ruled before the world turned to water. The Sumerians did not write for their own time. They wrote for the silence that would follow them. They wrote for us. And as we listen to those echoes, the void begins to speak. It tells us that we are not the first, and we will not be the last. It tells us that the blueprint is still there, waiting to be read. All we have to do is find the courage to remember. The weight of this realization is what makes the study of Sumer so dangerous to our current narrative. It suggests that our history is not a straight line, but a cycle of forgetting and remembering, of falling and rising. We are in the remembering phase now. The dust is being brushed away. The wedges in the clay are becoming words again. And as those words form into sentences, they are building a bridge back to the time when the gods walked among men. They are rewriting the creation mythos not as a fairy tale, but as a legacy. The echoes of the void are finally becoming clear, and they're saying that the beginning was never what we thought it was. It was only the start of the return. Beneath the shifting sands of Iraq, a name remains. It is a name that has traveled through the dust of 5,000 years. Anunnaki, those who from the heavens descended. For a century, we have called them myth. We have called them projections of a primitive mind seeking a father in the sky. But the Sumerians did not write about them as fantasies. They wrote about them as a physical presence. They wrote about them as teachers who walked beside them in the cool of the day. They were the shining ones, the architects of the human soul, and their legacy is carved into the very clay we are only now beginning to understand. The story of the Anunnaki is not just a story of gods. It is a story of a cosmic inheritance. To the Sumerians, the Anunnaki were the great assembly of 50 gods. They were the ones who decided the fates. But their story begins long before the first city of Eridu was raised from the mud. It begins in a place they call the Duku, the Holy Mound, the place where heaven and earth met. They speak of a time when the gods themselves labored, when the heavy work of digging the rivers and raising the mountains fell upon the shoulders of the divine. For thousands of years, they say, the lesser gods carried the burden. They toiled under a sun that did not yet shine on a human face. But eventually, the burden became too great. The gods revolted. They threw down their tools and demanded a solution. It is here that the records take a turn that should make us stop and wonder. The god Enki, the master of the deep waters and the wisest of the council, proposed a radical plan. He did not suggest a miracle. He did not speak of magic. He spoke of a process. He spoke of creating a servant who could bear the yoke of the gods. He spoke of the Lulu, the primitive worker. But the creation of the Lulu was not an act of simple pottery. The Sumerians tell us that Enki and the goddess Ninhursag, the Lady of Life, went into a place they called a house of fashioning. It was a place of mystery, a place of biology. They did not just shape clay and breathe life into it. They tell us they mixed the clay of the earth with the blood of a god. They mixed the essence of the divine with the matter of the world. Think about that word for a moment, blood. In the cuneiform tablets, the word for blood often carries the meaning of life essence or genetic memory. They were describing a mingling, a fusion of two different natures. The Sumerians were recording a genetic event. They were saying that humanity is a hybrid. We are part earth and part heaven. We are a species with a divided soul. This was the birth of the Lulu Amalu, the one who was made to work. But as the story unfolds, the creation becomes something more than a servant. The Lulu begins to think. The Lulu begins to remember. The Lulu begins to look at the stars and recognize the home of its makers. Among the thousands of tablets recovered from the ruins of Nineveh, the Atrahasis epic tells this story with a detail that is unsettling. It describes the trial and error of the gods. It tells of the first versions of humanity that failed. Those who were blind, those who were mute, those who could not reproduce. It sounds less like a divine poem and more like a laboratory journal. They were searching for a balance. They were looking for the perfect vessel for their essence. And when they finally succeeded, they did not just give us life. They gave us the me, the divine formulas, the codes of civilization. To the Sumerians, knowledge was not something we discovered on our own. It was a download. It was a gift given by the Shining Ones to their children. But who were these Shining Ones? When we look at the stone reliefs found in the palaces of the north, we see them depicted in a way that defies our traditional view of the ancient world. They are tall. They are majestic. They often carry a small bucket in one hand and a pine cone in the other. For decades, archaeologists call these ritual objects. They called them symbols of fertility or purification. But look closer. They wear wristbands that look like modern watches. They stand beside a stylized tree that many researchers now believe is a representation of the DNA double helix. The pine cone is pressed against the forehead of the king, as if they were stimulating the pineal gland, as if they were activating a hidden potential within the human mind. They were not just rulers. They were gardeners of a human consciousness. The Anunnaki were led by a council of three. Anu, the sky father who remained in the distant heavens. Enlil, the lord of the air who wanted order and control. And Enki, the friend of humanity who lived in the Abzu, the deep. The rivalry between Enlil and Enki is the hidden engine of human history. Enlil saw humanity as a noise, a disturbance, a mistake that needed to be managed or erased. But Enki saw us as a masterpiece. He was the one who whispered the secrets of the flood to the survivor. He was the one who ensured that the seed of humanity would not be lost. He was a protector of the bloodline, the one who believed that the Lulu could one day become as the gods themselves. In the records of the Sumerians, the Anunnaki did not stay forever. There was a moment of departure, a moment when the link was severed. They speak of a time when the gods withdrew into the heavens. They left behind the kings, the ones who were the mediators between the sky and the soil, the ones who carried the divine right to rule, because they carried the divine blood in their veins. This is why the Sumerian king list is so obsessed with the descent of kingship. It was not just a political office. It was a biological connection to the makers. When the Anunnaki left, they did not leave us empty-handed. They left us with the stars. They left us with the mathematics. They left us with the longing to return. Many scholars have pointed to the striking parallels between the Anunnaki and the Watchers mentioned in the Book of Enoch, the beings who descended to Earth and taught humanity the secrets of metallurgy, astronomy, and medicine. The ones who saw that the daughters of men were fair and took them as wives. The result of this union was the Nephilim, the giants, the men of renown. The Sumerians tell the same story, but they tell it from the perspective of the makers. They do not see it as a sin. They see it as a continuation of the experiment, the mingling of the celestial and the terrestrial. It is a story that repeats in every corner of the ancient world, from the Titans of Greece to the Devas of India. It is the memory of a time when we were not alone. But there's a darker side to the legacy of the Shining Ones. The Sumerians speak of the me as tablets of power. These were not just records. They were technologies. They were the blueprints for every craft, every law, and every scientific principle. Whoever held the me held the power to structure reality. In the myths, the goddess Inanna travels to the Abzu to steal the me from Enki. She wants to bring civilization to her city of Uruk. She tricks him with wine and carries the tablets away in her boat of heaven. When she arrives in Uruk, the city suddenly blossoms. It becomes the center of the world. This is not a story of a girl stealing a book. It is a story of the transfer of advanced technology. It is a story of how civilization can be sparked in an instant by the possession of the right codes. The more we decipher these records, the more we realize that our current understanding of human progress is a house of cards. We want to believe that we crawled out of the mud and slowly figured out the world. But the Sumerians tell us that we were helped. They tell us that we are a species with amnesia, living in the ruins of a much older and much more complex world. The Anunnaki were the ones who gave us the tools to remember. They gave us the writing system that could trap a voice in clay for 5 millennia. They gave us the numbers that still govern our satellites and our space probes. They gave us the zodiac that still maps our journey through the cosmic year. What if the Anunnaki were not gods from a different dimension, but travelers from a different part of the cosmos? The Sumerians called their home Nibiru, the crossing place. They describe it as a distant member of our own solar system that returns once every 3,600 years. While modern astronomers search for Planet 9 in the cold reaches of space, the Sumerians were already writing about its influence. They were already calculating its orbit. They believed that the arrival of Nibiru was a time of great change, a time when the Shining Ones would return to check on their garden. It is a thought that changes the way we look at the night sky. As we stand in the museums of the modern world, looking at the stone faces of the Anunnaki, we are looking at our own reflection. We are looking at the creators who mix their blood with our clay. They are the reason we look at the stars and feel a pull that we cannot explain. They are the reason we seek order in the chaos. They are the reason we have the mathematics to calculate the infinite and the poetry to mourn the finite. The Sumerians were not just recording their own time. They were recording our origin. They were telling us that we are the children of the Shining Ones, and that one day the memory in our blood will finally awaken. The clay is speaking. The voices are returning. And the legacy of the Anunnaki is finally coming into the light. It is a legacy that suggests we are more than we ever dared to imagine. We are the survivors of the flood. We are the keepers of the me. We are the ones who carry the fire of heaven in a vessel of earth. And the return is just beginning. The air in the desert does not just carry heat. It carries the weight of a geometric silence. We have been taught that science is a ladder. We have climbed one rung at a time from the mud to the stars. But the clay tablets of Sumer tell a different story. They speak of a science that arrived finished, a mathematics that was not discovered through trial and error, but was handed down as a complete system. This is the mystery of the substrate, the hidden layer of knowledge that makes our modern world possible, yet remains entirely unexplained. When we look at the ruins of Uruk or the foundations of Ziggurat, at UR, we see more than just piled brick. We see a message written in the language of numbers. This is where history becomes impossible. The Sumerians did not use the base 10 system that we use today. They chose base 60. At first glance, it seems cumbersome. But look closer. 60 is the smallest number that can be divided by the first 6 counting numbers. It is elegant. It is perfectly suited for geometry and the measurement of time. Every time you look at your watch or check a compass, you are speaking the language of ancient Sumer. We divide the hour into 60 minutes and the minute into 60 seconds. We divide the circle into 360 degrees. Why? Because the Sumerians understood that the heartbeat of the universe is not decimal. It is sexagesimal. They understood that the heavens and the earth are tied together by a single mathematical thread. But here is what keeps modern astronomers awake at night. The Sumerians knew about the precession of the equinoxes. This is the slow wobble of the earth on its axis. It is a movement so gradual that it takes 72 years for the stars to shift just 1 degree in the sky. To observe this shift and recognize it as a consistent cycle requires systematic records spanning hundreds, if not thousands of years. It requires a level of patience and data collection that should have been impossible for a culture that had supposedly just emerged from the Stone Age. Yet their tablets are filled with it. They track the great year, a cycle that takes 25,920 years to complete. They divided this vast span of time into 12 houses of the zodiac, a map of the sky that we still use today to name the constellations. How did they know? How could they measure a cycle that takes nearly 26 millennia to finish when their civilization supposedly only lasted a fraction of that time? The answer they gave was simple. They did not discover it. They were taught it. They spoke of the me. These were the divine formulas of the cosmos, the blueprints of reality. To the Sumerians, these were physical objects, tablets that contained the source code for everything from the movement of the planets to the art of weaving. When the goddess Inanna took me to her city, she was not just taking symbols. She was taking the actual technology of civilization. We call it myth. They called it history. And the numbers they recorded in their king list bear this out. We often look at the impossible reigns of the ancient kings as fantasy, rulers who lived for tens of thousands of years. But when you apply Sumerian mathematics to those numbers, something haunting emerges. The total length of the reigns before the flood is recorded as 432,000 years. This is not a random number. It is a fractal of the precession of the equinoxes. It is a multiple of the great year. This same number, 432, appears in the sacred texts of India and the myths of the Norse. It is the number of the Kali Yuga. It is the number of the warriors who march out of Valhalla. It is as if a single mathematical signature was stamped onto memory of every ancient culture on Earth. A signature that points back to a shared inheritance of cosmic knowledge. The Sumerians also understood the proportions of the Earth itself. The dimensions of their greatest temples often reflect the ratios of the planet. They understood the value of pi long before the Greeks claimed it as their own. In the construction of their ziggurats, they used the 3-4-5 triangle to ensure perfect right angles. They understood that the physical world is a reflection of a deeper geometric order. This was not a primitive culture trying to make sense of the world. This was a sophisticated culture trying to rebuild a world that had already been lost. Among the thousands of tablets recovered from the desert, there are maps of the solar system. They show the planets in their correct order. They even seem to show planets that we did not rediscover until the invention of the telescope. There are cylinder seals that depict the sun at the center of the solar system, an idea that would get men burned at the stake thousands of years later. They knew about the rings of Saturn and the moons of Jupiter. They spoke of a cosmos that was alive and ordered, a universe where everything from the smallest grain of sand to the most distant star was part of a single calculated plan. But it is not just their astronomy that defies explanation. It is their chemistry and metallurgy. They knew how to create bronze by mixing copper and tin in precise proportions. They knew how to refine gold and silver. They possessed formulas for the creation of glass and the dyeing of cloth that are still effective today. They had a word for the tiny particles that make up all matter, a word that sounds suspiciously like the modern concept of the atom. They spoke of these things as though they were common knowledge, as though they had been part of the human experience since the beginning of time. This leads us to the most unsettling possibility of all. What if the Sumerians were not the beginning of civilization? What if they were the survivors of a previous one? A civilization that had already mastered the stars and the elements. A world that was wiped clean by the great flood they so carefully recorded. If you look at their knowledge as a recovery effort rather than an invention, the pieces begin to fit. The suddenness of their appearance, the complexity of their laws, the precision of their math. It was not a growth, it was a restoration. They were the keepers of the code, the guardians of the substrate. We look at our modern technology and we feel a sense of pride. We have moved from the clay tablet to the silicon chip, but the logic is the same. The binary code of our computers is just a more rapid version of the wedge marks in the mud, presence or absence, mark or void. The Sumerians were the first to understand that the world could be translated into data. They understood that if you hold the numbers, you hold the power to shape reality. They called it the me. We call it programming. But the soul of the science is the same. The silence of the Iraqi desert is not empty. It is filled with the echoes of a science that we are only now beginning to understand again. We have spent centuries thinking we were the first to conquer the laws of nature. We thought we were the first to measure the stars. But the Sumerians are still there in the dust, waiting for us to realize that we are just repeating their calculations. We are just tracing the lines they already drew. If their science was an inheritance, then we must ask who left it for them. Who were the original architects of the great year? Who was it that measured the wobble of the earth before the first city was ever built? The Sumerians had a name for them. They called them the Watchers, the ones who came from the sky and mixed the clay and the spirit. We have turned them into gods because we do not know how else to describe a knowledge that exceeds our own. But perhaps they were simply the masters of a science that we have yet to fully rediscover. The clay doesn't lie. It remembers. It remembers a time when the heavens were a book and the earth was its reflection. It remembers a time when humanity was part of a cosmic conversation. Every equation we solve and every star we map brings us closer to that old conversation. We are not discovering the universe. We are remembering it. We are returning to the geometry of the origin. And as we dig deeper into the mud of Mesopotamia, we find that the most impossible science of the ancients is the science of who we used to be. The records are there. The numbers are clear. The only thing missing is our willingness to believe what the clay is telling us, that we were once greater than we are now, and that the path to our future is buried in the dust of our forgotten past. The return is not just a dream. It is a mathematical certainty. The cycle of the great year is turning, and the silence of Sumer is about to break. Imagine the sky turning the color of bruised iron. The wind over Mesopotamian plains carries no heat now, only the scent of a rising sea that should not be here. For the Sumerians, the Great Flood was not a story in a holy book. It was a scar that marked the middle of human time. Everything before was divine. Everything after was a struggle to remember. Beneath the layers of silt and broken brick, the clay tablets tell a moment when the world simply stopped. A moment when the gods decided the human experiment was too loud, too chaotic, and needed to be erased. This is the story of the witness who watched the first world drown, and the records that suggest we are living in the aftermath of a total planetary reset. The Sumerian king list is perhaps the most unsettling administrative document ever recovered. It lists the rulers of cities like Eridu and Bad Tibra, with the same boring precision as a tax ledger. But before the waters came, the numbers are impossible. It says kingship descended from heaven, and Elohim ruled for 28,800 years. Alaungar ruled for 36,000 years. In total, 8 kings ruled 5 cities for a span of 241,200 years. Then, the text drops away into a chillingly simple phrase. Then the flood swept over. Scholars have spent over a century trying to explain these numbers away. They call them symbolic. They call them astronomical cycles disguised as history. But to the Sumerian scribe pressing his stylus into wet mud, these were not metaphors. They were the record of the time before the great catastrophe, a time when the boundary between the stars and the earth was thin, and the rulers lived for spans that mock our modern understanding of biology. Was this king list a celestial calendar, or were the Sumerians remembering a version of humanity that operated under different physical rules, a version that was nearly wiped from existence by a wall of water? The record of this disaster is found in the Epic of Zayusadra, a text that predates the biblical story of Noah by more than 1,000 years. Zayusadra was a king of Shuruppak, a city whose ruins still sit in the desert of southern Iraq. The tablets tell us that the gods, led by the storm god Enlil, grew weary of the noise of humankind. They decreed a total annihilation. But Enki, the god of wisdom and the one who shaped the first humans from clay, could not allow the memory of life to vanish. He could not speak directly to the king. So he whispered to the wall of Zayusadra, this reed hut. He told the wall to build a giant vessel. He told the wall to carry the seeds of all living things and the blueprints of civilization. This detail is crucial. Zayusadra was not just saving animals. He was saving the code of humanity. He was saving the mathematics, the star charts, and the laws that the Sumerians believed had been given to them at the beginning of time. When the storm arrived, it was described as a weapon of the gods. The tablets say the light of day turned to darkness. The wind howled like a wild animal. For 7 days and 7 nights, the foundations of the earth were submerged. When Zayusadra finally opened a window and the sunlight hit the water, he wept. The world he knew was gone. Every city, every library, every tower had been turned back into mud. Archaeologists in the early 20th century, led by Sir Leonard Woolley, found physical evidence of this silence. Beneath the royal tombs of Uar, they dug through layers of human habitation until they hit a massive deposit of clean, sterile silt. It was nearly 10 feet thick. There were no artifacts in it, no broken pots, no bones. It was a mark of a flood so powerful it stripped the land bare, leaving only river mud behind. Beneath that silt, the archaeologists found even older tools, flint and pottery from a culture that seemed entirely different from the Sumerians. It was a physical confirmation that a world had ended, and a new one had begun on top of its grave. What changed after the waters receded is what keeps researchers awake at night. After the flood, kingship descended from heaven once again, but the reigns became human. Instead of tens of thousands of years, the kings ruled for centuries, then decades. It was as if the life force of the world had been diluted, as if the connection to the earlier source had been damaged. The Sumerians called themselves the black-headed people, but they lived in the shadow of the antediluvians. They spent their entire existence trying to rebuild the greatness of the world that had drowned. They were not inventing a new society. They were performing a restoration. This concept of restoration is the key to understanding why Sumer appeared so suddenly and so perfectly formed. They were the children of the survivors. They used the base 60 mathematics because that was the math of the old world. They mapped the precession of the equinoxes because their ancestors had watched the stars for thousands of years before the flood. Their technical vocabulary, which linguists find so strange and isolated, may be the last surviving echo of a language spoken before the catastrophe, a language that was designed to describe the laws of the universe, not just the needs of the field. In the ruins of Nineveh, in the great library of Ashurbanipal, a tablet was found that tells the story from the perspective of survivor. It is the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The survivor, called Utnapishtim in this version, tells the hero Gilgamesh that the gods were once his neighbors. He describes a boat he built as a perfect cube, divided into 7 decks. It was a geometric structure, not just a raft. It was a container for the blueprints of reality. When Gilgamesh asks how he can achieve immortality like the survivors of the flood, he is told that the world has changed. The old age is over. The gods have withdrawn. The direct link to the heavens is broken. Every ancient culture on earth carries the same scar. The Hindus speak of the Manu, who was worn by a fish to build a boat. The Greeks tell of Deucalion and Pyrrhus surviving the wrath of Zeus. The Mayas speak of the earlier worlds destroyed by water because the humans forgot to honor their creators. We are told these are just myths, but when you lay the maps together, you see the same story repeated across every continent. A divine warning, a vessel, a mountain where the boat comes to rest, a new beginning from ruins. The Sumerian records are the oldest and most detailed version of this memory. They suggest that the flood was not a local event, but a global reset that turned history into prehistory. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Sumerian flood records is the reason given for the destruction. It was not always about sin or morality. In the Atrahasis epic, the gods complained humanity was too noisy. They could not sleep. Scholars suggest this noise was a sound of overpopulation and industrial expansion. The gods were not punishing evil. They were managing the world like a garden that had grown too wild. They wanted to return to the silence. This paints a picture of a pre-flood world that was far more advanced and populated than we are taught. A world of cities and technologies that made enough noise to reach the heavens. When we look at the precision of the Sumerian star charts and the complexity of their laws, we are looking at the fragments Isidore carried off the boat. We are looking at the shards of a shattered mirror. The Sumerians were obsessed with the idea of the me, the divine formulas of civilization. They believed these formulas had to be protected at all cost. If they were lost, the world would fall back into the water. This is why they wrote everything on clay. They knew that what burns and papyrus rots and stone crumbles, but baked earth can wait for millennia beneath the sand. They were writing to us. They were writing to the people who would inhabit the next cycle of history. If the Sumerian records are true, then the origin of humanity is not a slow climb out of a cave. It is a story of a great fall followed by a desperate attempt to remember. We are the descendants of the witnesses. We carry in our DNA and our languages the echoes of a world that was erased because it grew too loud. The ziggurats were not just temples. They were attempts to reach back to the height we once occupied. The star charts were not just for navigation. They were the maps of the home we lost. And the silence of the Iraqi desert is the same silence that followed the storm. We must ask ourselves what else is buried beneath that silt. If Woolley found a 10-foot layer of mud at UR, what lies beneath the unexplored mounds of the southern marshes? There are thousands of sites that have never been touched by a spade. There are archives waiting to tell us the names of the kings who ruled when the stars were different. There are records that might explain why the reigns of the first kings were measured in thousands of years. The Sumerians believed that history moves in circles, that the waters will always return when the world grows too noisy. As we move deeper into these records, the line between myth and reality continues to dissolve. The Sumerians did not distinguish between the two. For them, the flood was as real as the clay in their hands. The gods were as real as the planets in the sky. And the survivor was the one who ensured that we would one day be able to read these words. The deluge witness was the bridge between two worlds, one that was divine and one that is human. And the records he left behind are the only map we have of the world that came before our own. The next time the desert wind shifts the sand, it may reveal the final piece of the puzzle, a tablet that tells us not just how the world ended, but what we were before the water took everything away. The silence of the desert is not empty. It is heavy with the voices of a civilization that refused to be forgotten. They wrote their names in the mud and waited for the waters to recede. They waited for us to find them. And as we brush away the dust of 5,000 years, we realize that we are not just studying the past. We are remembering ourselves. The story of the flood is a story of human resilience, but it is also a warning. The earth remembers the water. The clay remembers the storm. And the tablets are still here, waiting to tell us the truth about the catastrophe that changed everything. The transition from the old world to the new was not a beginning. It was a recovery. And the most important records are those that show us exactly what we have lost. Beneath the ruins of Nineveh, a story rests in the dark. It is older than the Bible, older than the Greeks, older than any memory we hold sacred. It speaks of a time when the heavens labored, when the earth was a workshop, and when humanity was not born, but forged. In the Sumerian archives, there is no mention of a garden or a forbidden fruit. Instead, there is something much more unsettling. A process of creation that reads like a blueprint, a mingling of earth and divinity that suggests we are not merely children of the stars, but a calculated design. This is the Enuma Elish, the epic of creation. But if you look past the poetry, you find a code, a genetic inheritance that changes everything we know about our origins. The tablets tell of a divine assembly, weary of the work. The gods were tired. They were exhausted by the maintenance of the world. They looked for a servant. They looked for a solution. And it was Enki, the god of wisdom, who spoke the word. He did not suggest a miracle. He suggested a fusion. Take the clay of the earth, he said, and mix it with the blood of a god. This opening scene from the Enuma Elish and the Atrahasis epic is often dismissed as myth. We call it primitive. Folklore. We call it a symbolic attempt to explain the unknown. But the language used in these 7 tablets is hauntingly precise. It describes a procedure. It describes the preparation of a divine essence. The Sumerians did not say we were created by a thought or a breath. They said we were made from a mixture, the blood of Kingu, a deity, sacrificed for his spirit, was blended with the red earth. They called the result the Lulu, the primitive worker, a hybrid being designed to stand where the gods once stood. If you listen to the rhythm of the text, it does not sound like a prayer. It sounds like an operation. The air above the Mesopotamian plains is heavy with the weight of this possibility. What if the blood of the gods was not a metaphor? What if it was a reference to the genetic code itself? The Sumerians spoke of the me, divine formulas that governed every aspect of life. There were formulas for kingship, formulas for music, and formulas for the human body. To the Ancient scribe, these were physical objects, tablets that could be stolen, transferred, and used to rebuild civilization. Today, we have another name for these fundamental codes. We call them molecular blueprints. We call them instructions written in the language of the cell. The Sumerians documented these as if they were software for reality. They believed that whoever possessed the codes held the power to shape life itself. The tablets describe a laboratory of creation. They speak of the house of Shimbi, the house where the breath of life is breathed in. There, Ninursag, the Lady of Life, worked alongside Enki. They did not succeed on the first attempt. This is perhaps the most unsettling detail in the entire Sumerian record. A perfect god would not fail, but the teachers from the sky did. The tablets record a series of experiments that went wrong. They created beings that could not see, beings that could not eat, beings with faulty limbs and broken spirits. They were learning. They were refining the mixture. They were adjusting the balance between the earthly clay and the divine blood. This is not the language of a sudden miracle. This is the language of trial and error. This is the record of a geneticist working through the complexities of a new species. Eventually, they achieved success. They created the first Adamu, the one who is like the earth. But even then, the process was systematic. The tablets describe the use of 14 birth goddesses, 7 on the left and 7 on the right. It reads like an assembly line of biological production. They were not creating one man. They were initiating a population. The blood of the gods was being distributed. The spirit of the divine was being fragmented into thousands of mortal vessels. We are told that we carry the essence of the Anunnaki within us, a divine spark trapped in a body of earth, a molecular legacy that links us to those who descended from the sky. But why would they do this? The records are brutally honest. They did not create us out of love. They created us because they were tired of digging the canals. They created us to maintain the irrigation systems of the gods. We were the biological solution to a labor shortage. This perspective shatters the comfortable narratives of modern religion. It suggests that our beginning was not an act of grace, but an act of engineering. And yet there is a twist in the story. Enki, the architect of our species, grew fond of his creation. He gave us more than just the ability to work. He gave us the me. He gave us the capacity for wisdom. He gave us a part of himself that the other gods never intended us to have. He turned a servant into a successor. This is why the Enuma Elish is so dangerous to our understanding of history. It suggests that our sudden leap in intelligence was not the result of slow evolution. It suggests that the transition from the Stone Age to the Sumerian civilization was a designed event. The molecular code of the gods was the catalyst. It was the shining liquid that made the clay speak. When British archaeologists first translated these lines in the late 18th century, they were scandalized. They saw only a dark parody of the Bible. But today, as we unravel the human genome, the parody is beginning to look like a report. We are finding that the human genetic sequence contains gaps and sudden insertions that defy simple evolutionary logic. We are finding traces of a story that matches the clay. Consider the Sumerian term for the genetic essence. They called it the spirit of the blood. They believed that this spirit held the memory of the heavens. It was the link between the mortal and the immortal. When a king was crowned in Uruk, he was said to be of the seed of the gods. This was not just a title. It was a claim of lineage. It was an assertion that his mixture was more divine than that of the common man. The entire social structure of Sumer was built upon this genetic hierarchy. The closer you were to the original bloodline of the Anunnaki, the closer you were to the right to rule. We see the same obsession with bloodlines in every ancient empire, from the pharaohs of Egypt to the emperors of China. They were all trying to preserve a specific molecular inheritance. They were all guarding the blood of the gods. The air in the desert stays still as we contemplate the implications. If we are a designed species, then our purpose is not what we have been told. The Sumerians believed we were a bridge, a way for the divine to interact with the physical. They aligned their cities to the stars because their blood responded to the heavens. They built the ziggurats as landing places for their makers. They were not looking up in wonder. They were looking up in recognition. They knew that their molecular code was a map that pointed back to the crossing place. In the libraries of Nineveh, the 7 tablets of creation are kept with meticulous care. Each wedge mark is a witness to a fusion that took place in the deep past. The text tells us that after the Lulu were created, the gods rejoiced. They were finally free from the labor. But Enlil, the king, grew wary. He saw that the humans were increasing. He saw that they were becoming like the gods. They were learning the me. They were discovering the formulas of the universe. The creation was beginning to rival the creator. This is the root of the ancient conflict that appears in every mythology. The fear that humanity would realize its own potential. The fear that we would discover the code within the blood. What if the records we find in the mud of Iraq are the last surviving manuals of our own construction? The Sumerians did not write for the sake of fantasy. They wrote to preserve the foundation. They documented the chemical and biological origins of our species with gravity that demands our attention. They told us that we are mixed. They told us that we are air and earth. They told us that we are mortal and divine. And they warned us that the gods who gave us life are the same gods who can take it away. The flood, which we will explore in the next segment, was the first attempt to correct the mistake. The first attempt to erase the noise of creation that had grown too loud. As we stand before these tablets, we realize that the Enuma Elish is not just a story about the past. It is a revelation about the present. It suggests that we are walking through the world with a secret hidden in our very selves, a genetic code that was deliberately placed there by teachers. From the sky, we are the Lulu. We are the primitive workers who inherited the wisdom of the gods. And as we begin to master the me for ourselves, as we begin to rewrite our own genetic blueprint, we are finally stepping back into the house of Shimti. We are becoming the creators, the Sumerians. Remembered, the silence of the desert is not an empty silence. It is a silence of waiting. The clay tablets have held their breath for 5,000 years. They have watched empires rise and fall. They have seen the blood of the gods diluted by time and distance. But the code remains. The wedge marks are still there, waiting for a generation that can finally read the data. Beneath the poetry, they speak of a truth that is written in our veins. A truth that says we are not an accident of nature. We are an act of will. We are the survivors of an ancient experiment, and the blood that flows in our hearts is the last remaining echo of the heavens. The Sumerians knew that knowledge could be forgotten. They knew that the flood could erase the memory of the workshop, but they also knew that the clay would remain. They believed that one day we would find these tablets. We would find the records of the 14 wombs and the sacrifice of Kingu, and in that moment, the circle would be complete. We would finally understand that we are not alone in the universe. We are part of a lineage that stretches back to the crossing place. We are the living archive of the Anunnaki, and the records of Sumer are the keys to unlocking the secret of who we truly are. The horizon of southern Iraq is broken by a shadow that should not be there. A mountain made of mud and bitumen rising from a plain so flat that the earth seems to hold its breath. This is the great ziggurat of Uar. It stands as a silent sentinel over a graveyard of empires, a massive three-tiered structure that once reached toward the heavens. But when you stand at its base, looking up at the sheer scale of construction, a single question begins to hum in the desert heat. How? History tells us that this was the work of King Uar-Nammu around 2100 years before the Common Era. We are told the Sumerians were simply clever builders who used the materials they had at hand: mud, water, and straw. But as we dig deeper into the records and the stones themselves, the official story begins to crumble like sun-dried brick. The ziggurats were not merely temples. They were feats of engineering that should have been impossible for a culture just emerging from the Stone Age. They were built with a systematic precision that implies a level of architectural knowledge we are only now beginning to appreciate. What if the Sumerians were not the architects of these mountains, but the restorers? What if they were following blueprints left behind by a civilization that the desert had already forgotten? Consider the sheer mathematics of the build. The great ziggurat of Uar contains millions of bricks. Each one was baked in a kiln to make it resistant to the elements. These were not the crude mud blocks of a primitive village. They were standardized, uniform, and incredibly durable. Between the layers of brick, the builders placed mats of woven reeds and coated them with bitumen, a natural tar that acted as a waterproof binder. This technique prevented the massive weight of the structure from crushing itself and allowed it to withstand the occasional torrential rains of the Mesopotamian plains. The architects even built a complex system of weep holes, small channels that allowed moisture to drain from the heart of the structure. They understood the expansion and contraction of Earth. They understood the pressure of gravity. They understood the physics of the mountain. But where did they learn these lessons? In the standard historical narrative, architecture evolves slowly. You build a hut, then a house, then a palace, then a monument. There's a trail of trial and error. But in Sumer, the ziggurats arrived as if they had been downloaded into the collective mind of the people. They were massive, complex, and perfect from the moment the first brick was laid. The Sumerians themselves did not claim to have invented these designs. In their own clay records, they speak of the Apkallu, the 7 sages who emerged from the sea to bring the arts of civilization to humanity. These were the teachers who gave them the measures of the earth and the plans for the temples. According to the myths, the ziggurats were built upon the foundations of the Apsu, the primeval deep waters where the god Enki lived. The ziggurat was not just a building. It was a bridge. It was a point of contact between the human realm and the divine realm. But when we look at the ruins today, we have to ask if the divine realm was actually a memory of a higher technology. The precision of the alignment is the first clue. Every major ziggurat was oriented to cardinal points of the compass with an accuracy that rivals modern surveying. This implies a mastery of astronomy that should have taken thousands of years to develop, yet the Sumerians possessed it from their first day in the sun. Imagine the scene 5,000 years ago. The sun sets over the Euphrates, and the stars begin to ignite in a sky untainted by the lights of man. A priest stands on the highest terrace of the ziggurat, recording the position of Venus. He is not just looking at a light in the sky. He is consulting a clock that has been ticking since before the flood. The Sumerians recorded that their kingship descended from heaven, and their buildings reflect that belief. They were not building upward to find the gods. They were building landing pads for those who had already been here. The ziggurat of Enlil at Nippur was known as the Duranki, the bond of heaven and earth. It was believed to be the anchor point of the entire world, a place where the frequencies of the cosmos were channeled into the soil. When archaeologists first excavated the base of these structures, they found something even more unsettling. Beneath the ziggurats of the historical period, there are layers of much older construction. In the city of Eridu, researchers found 18 successive temples built on top of one another, reaching back into the darkness of the 6th millennium. The oldest structures are small and simple, but they are perfectly placed. It is as if someone had marked the spot with a stake in the ground and said, "Here's the center. Here's where the mountain must rise." But who made that decision? Who understood the ley lines of the earth and the movements of the stars before history had even begun? The Sumerians called themselves the black-headed people, but they spoke of the ones who came before as the gods of the mountain. We must look at the bricks themselves once more. Thousands of them are stamped with the name of the king, a practice we see throughout history. But recent analysis has shown that the mortar and the composition of the bricks at the deepest levels contain mineral traces that suggest a sophisticated understanding of material science. They use salt to strengthen the mud. They use bitumen to create an airtight seal. They were creating an artificial mountain that could survive for 10,000 years. And it has. Despite the wars, the winds, and the weight of time, the core of the ziggurat remains. It is a testament to a science that we are only now starting to decode. We look at these ruins and see a primitive people worshiping the sky. But perhaps they were a desperate people trying to maintain a technology they had inherited but could no longer fully reproduce. The records tell us of me, the divine formulas that governed every aspect of civilization. There were me for kingship, for music, for weaving, and most importantly, for the building of temples. These me were physical objects, tablets, or scrolls that were kept in the temple of Enki at Eridu. They were the blueprints for reality. When the goddess Inanna wanted to bring civilization to her city of Uruk, she stole the me from Enki. This story is often read as a simple myth about the rivalry between cities. But what if it is a record of the transfer of technical data? What if the knowledge to build the ziggurats was a literal set of instructions that could be moved, stolen, and used to raise a city from the sand? The air above southern Iraq shimmers with ancient heat. The silence of the desert is not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a library that has lost its librarian. We walk through the ruins of Uruk and Uar, looking at the stairways that lead to nowhere, and we wonder who really walked those steps. The Sumerians claim they were the servants of the architects. They were the ones who carried the bricks. But they were not the ones who drew the lines. They spoke of the Anunnaki as the ones who designed the cities in the time before the flood. If we take their records literally, we find ourselves looking at a history that does not fit into our textbooks. We find ourselves looking at a world where humanity was given the keys to a kingdom it did not build. There is a technical detail that often goes unnoticed by the casual observer. The ziggurats were not built with vertical walls. They were built with a slight inward curve, a technique called entasis that would later be used by the Greeks in the Parthenon. This curve creates an optical illusion of strength and stability. It makes the structure look more natural, more like a part of the earth itself. It is a sophisticated architectural trick that requires complex calculations of perspective and proportion. How did a culture of farmers and fishermen discover the secrets of optical illusion and structural engineering? The more we study the ziggurats, the more they look like the work of a global consciousness. Similar structures appear in Egypt, in Mexico, in Peru, and in Southeast Asia. Pyramids and ziggurats that all share the same mathematical foundations. They all point to the same stars. They all use the same ratios. It is as if a single architect had traveled the world, planting the seeds of civilization and leaving behind the blueprints for the mountains of the gods. The Sumerian king list says that before the flood, the gods ruled from the cities of the plain. They lived in the ziggurats. These were not just places of sacrifice. They were houses. They were headquarters. They were the centers of power where the measures of the world were determined. When the flood came, the cities were erased, but the foundations remained. When the waters receded, the Sumerians began the long work of restoration. They dug through the silt and the mud to find the holy places. They found the stamped bricks of the first kings, and they built upon them. They were not inventing a new world. They were trying to call back the old one. They were the children of a golden age, wandering through the ruins of their parents' palace, trying to put the pieces back together. This is the mystery of the ziggurats. They are too big for their time. They are too smart for their era. They stand in the desert as massive question marks, challenging everything we think we know about the progress of humanity. We like to think of history as a steady climb from the cave to the stars. But the Sumerians suggest that we have already been to the stars, and that the ziggurats were the bridges we built to get there. They suggest that we are a species with amnesia, living in a world of forgotten giants. The wind blows through the weep holes of the ziggurat of Uar, making a sound like a low, haunting whistle. It is the sound of a mountain that remembers its makers. It is the sound of a truth that is waiting to be heard. We look at the bricks and see mud. We look at the records and see myth. But the architects who drew the plans are still there, hidden in the geometry, waiting for us to learn how to read the lines. The great ziggurat of Uar was once a place of vibrant color and constant activity. The base was painted black with bitumen. The middle tier was red with the color of the earth. The top tier was white with the light of the moon. At the very summit sat the shrine of Nana, the moon god, plated in blue glazed tiles that shimmered like a piece of sky had fallen to earth. It was a beacon, a landmark that could be seen for miles across the flat Mesopotamian plains. It was a constant reminder that the world below was governed by the laws of the world above. But who established those laws? The Sumerians recorded that the first ziggurat was built by the god Enlil in the city of Nippur. It was called the bond of heaven and earth. This was not just a name. It was a function. The ziggurat was a machine for alignment. It was designed to harmonize the vibrations of the earth with the rhythms of the cosmos. When we look at the construction of the ziggurat, we see evidence of a labor force that was organized with military precision. Tens of thousands of workers, millions of man-hours. But labor alone cannot build a ziggurat. You need a vision. You need a master plan that accounts for the movement of the stars over centuries. The Sumerians understood that the earth was a sphere. They understood the precession of the equinoxes. They understood that the world was moving through a vast cycle of time. Their ziggurats were the markers of that cycle. They were the anchors that held their civilization in place as the heavens shifted above them. If we accept the Sumerian records as true, then we must accept that the architects of the ziggurats were not human. Or at least, they were not the humans we have been taught to believe in. They were the masters of the me, the guardians of the divine formulas, the ones who knew the secret of how to make the clay speak. The desert is a cruel keeper of secrets. It buries the truth under layers of sand and heat, waiting for someone to find the courage to dig. But the ziggurats are too large to stay buried. They rise up like the bones of a skeleton that refuse to stay in the grave. They are the evidence of a past that we are not yet ready to understand. A past where the line between heaven and earth was a stairway of bricks. A past where the architects were gods, and the builders were men who remembered. We look at the ruins of southern Iraq, and we see the beginning of history. But the ziggurats tell us that we are looking at the end of something much older. They're the last echoes of a world that was erased by water and time. They are the monuments of the forgotten architects. And until we understand who those architects truly were, we will never truly understand who we are. The staircases of the ziggurats still lead upward toward a sky that has not changed in 5,000 years. The stars that the Sumerians charted are the same stars that watch us tonight. The geometry of the mountain is still perfect. The bitumen is still black. The reeds are still woven into the heart of the brick. The message is there, written in the language of physics and gravity. It is a message that tells us that we were never alone at the beginning, that we were taught, that we were given the plans, and that the mountains we built were not just temples, but memories of home. The horizon of Iraq shimmers with ancient heat, and the ziggurat stands in the silence, waiting for us to climb the steps once more and look at the stars with the eyes of the architects. We have been taught that history is a straight line, a steady climb from the dirt to the stars. We are told that civilization began in a specific moment, in a specific place, exactly 5,500 years ago. But the clay tablets of Sumer do not describe a beginning. They describe a return. When we look at the chronology they left behind, the comfortable timeline of modern history begins to fracture and fall away. The Sumerians did not see themselves as the first. They saw themselves as the latest. They believed they were living in the shadow of a much longer, much older story that had been shattered by water and fire. If we listen to their records, the timeline of humanity does not start in the Bronze Age. It stretches back into a deep, dark past that we are only now beginning to glimpse. This is the collapse of our calendar, the moment when the dates we have memorized are replaced by a history that is far more ancient and far more mysterious than we ever dared to imagine. The Sumerian king list is the primary witness to this collapse. It is a document that should not exist. It is a precise bureaucratic record of kingship that begins with a phrase that haunts every historian who reads it. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was an eridu. The list then records the reigns of 8 kings who ruled before a great flood. but it is the duration of their rules that shatters our understanding of time. According to the clay, these 8 kings ruled for a combined total of 241,200 years. Alulim ruled for 28,000 years. Alaungar ruled for 36,000 years. And Menluana ruled for 43,200 years. To a modern scholar, these numbers are impossible. They are dismissed as myth, as symbolic markers of a golden age, or as mathematical errors. But the Sumerians were not a people prone to mathematical errors. They were the masters of numbers. They were the ones who gave us the base 60 system we still use to measure our lives. They were obsessed with the precision of the grain harvest and the exact movement of the stars. Why would a culture so dedicated to accuracy suddenly invent numbers that serve no purpose? Perhaps the error is not in their records, but in our perception of time. When the king list reaches the moment of the flood, it pauses. It says simply, "Then the flood swept over, and after the flood, kingship descended from heaven once more." At this point, the reigns of the kings begin to shrink. They drop from tens of thousands of years to hundreds of years, and finally to the decades we recognize today. Historians call this the transition from myth to history. But for the Sumerians, there was no transition. It was all one continuous record. They did not distinguish between the kings who ruled for millennia and the kings whose ruins we have actually excavated. To them, the timeline was unbroken. It was a single, long descent from a time of giants to a time of men. If we take these records seriously, we are forced to confront a terrifying possibility, that the 5,000 years of history we call civilization is merely a tiny fragment of a much larger cycle. This collapse of chronology is supported by what archaeologists find beneath the sand. When we dig into mounds of southern rock, we find layers of silt and mud that tell a story of catastrophic change. Beneath the oldest Sumerian cities lie even older foundations. At the site of Eridu, researchers found 18 levels of temples, each built on top of the one before. The deeper they dug, the more they realized that the origins of the city were pushed back further and further into the mist of prehistory. And it is not just in Iraq. Across the world, we are finding anomalies that do not fit the standard timeline. In Turkey, the pillars of Göbekli Tepe stand as a silent rebuke to every history book ever written. These massive stone circles, carved with intricate animals and celestial symbols, are 12,000 years old. That is 7,000 years before the pyramids. It is 6,000 years before the first Sumerian city. According to our timeline, the people who built Göbekli Tepe were simple hunter-gatherers who had not yet invented agriculture or pottery. Yet they moved stones weighing 20 tons and aligned them with the stars. The existence of Göbekli Tepe proves that the Sumerians were right. There was a high level of mathematical and architectural awareness long before the date we have set for the beginning of history. The timeline has collapsed. We are no longer looking at a slow evolution of primitive humans. We are looking at a lost epoch of sophisticated culture that was erased at the end of the last ice age. The Sumerians appear to be the heirs of this vanished world. Their sudden arrival in history with a fully formed language, a complex legal system, and advanced astronomy suggests that they were not inventing these things for the first time. They were restoring them. They were picking up the pieces of a broken blueprint and trying to build it again in the mud of Mesopotamia. This idea of restoration is hidden in the very language they used. They spoke of a time when knowledge was given to them by teachers who came from the sky. They called these beings the Anunnaki. In their records, the Anunnaki provided the measures, the numbers, and the laws that allowed civilization to function. If we look at this through a modern lens, We see a culture that did not believe it was responsible for its own genius. They saw themselves as the students of a much older intelligence. When we compare the Sumerian records to the records of Egypt and the Indus Valley, the synchronization is startling. Around the year 3000 before Common Era, complex civilizations appeared simultaneously in 3 different parts of the globe. Each of them possessed writing. Each of them possessed advanced mathematics. Each of them possessed obsession with the alignment of the stars. It is as if a single source of knowledge was distributed across the earth at the same moment. This is a synchronization problem that historians struggle to explain. How did 3 separate cultures, separated by thousands of miles, all cross the threshold of civilization at the exact same time? The Sumerian records offer an answer. They tell us that kingship was lowered from heaven. They tell us that the knowledge was a gift. If we accept their timeline, we see a world that was reset after a global catastrophe. The year 3000 before Common Era was not the start of human progress. It was the date of a global reconstruction. The Sumerians were part of a coordinated effort to bring order back to a chaotic world. They were using a timeline that recognized the vast spans of time that had come before the flood. But if this ancient timeline was so well known, why did we lose it? The answer lies in the shift from cyclical time to linear time. The Sumerians, like the Egyptians and the Maya, saw time as a wheel. They believed that history moved in vast cycles, repeated over and over. They calculated the precession of the equinoxes, a cycle that takes nearly 26,000 years to complete. They understood that the world goes through seasons of growth and seasons of destruction. But when the Greeks and the Romans rose to power, they changed the way we perceive history. They flattened the wheel into a line. They wanted a story that began with them and moved toward a future they could control. They took the vast, spiraling chronology of the ancient world and compressed it. They turned the kings of the king list into myths and the gods into fairy tales. They created a timeline that was short, manageable, and human. By the time the Roman Church established the calendar we use today, the erasure was complete. History was redefined as a period of only a few thousand years. Anything that happened before was consigned to the realm of legend or the darkness of the Stone Age. We became a species with amnesia. We forgot the 240,000 years of kingship. We forgot the teachers who descended from the sky. We forgot that we are the survivors of a world that was once much older and more sophisticated than our own. But the clay tablets do not forget. They sit in the silence of museum vaults, holding the record of our true duration. Every wedge-shaped mark is a reminder that our current timeline is a cage. When we break that cage, everything changes. The impossible reigns of the king list stop being fantasies and start being clues. If those kings were not individuals, but periods of time or celestial cycles, then the Sumerians were tracking a history that spans hundreds of thousands of years. They were recording the long, slow heartbeat of the planet. They were documenting the ages of the world that came before the ice melted. This new timeline changes our identity. We are no longer a young species just beginning to understand the universe. We are an old species, a weary species. Try to remember what we once knew. We are the architects who have forgotten how to read our own blueprints. The air above the Iraqi desert still shimmers with the heat of that forgotten past. The sand still hides the fragments of chronology that could change everything. When we look at the ruins of Uruk or Eridu, we are not looking at the birth of humanity. We are looking at a rescue operation. We are looking at a people who are desperately trying to save the secrets of the stars and the logic of the gods from the rising tide of forgetfulness. They wrote in clay because they knew that stone crumbles and papyrus rots. They wanted their timeline to survive the next flood. They wanted us to know that we have been here before, that we have built these towers before, that we have watched these same stars for 250,000 years. The collapse of the old chronology is not a loss. It is a recovery. It is the moment when we realize that the horizon of our history is much further away than we were told. We are standing on the shoulders of a giant whose name we have forgotten, but the Sumerians remembered. They pressed the truth into mud and let it dry in the sun. They left us the keys to a house we no longer recognize as our own. And as we begin to piece the fragments together, as we align the pillars of Turkey with the tablets of Iraq and the pyramids of Egypt, the new timeline emerges. It is a timeline of cycles, a timeline of restoration, a timeline that tells us that the end is always a beginning. We are not the first. And if we listen to the whispers in the clay, we will realize that we have a very long way to go before we truly understand where we came from. The dust is settling and the truth is waiting. It is time to look at the calendar with new eyes. It is time to accept that the story of humanity is not a line, but a circle, and that circle is far larger than we ever imagined